Welcome to tonight's case. I am Dr. John Watson, friend and chronicler of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. What you are about to hear is not merely a story of murder, but of illusion so perfect that hundreds witnessed it and applauded. A man died on the stage of a grand opera, struck down in full view of the audience, yet no one realized it was real. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And what is your favorite Sherlock Holmes story? And remember, you can also listen to these cases on Spotify anytime you wish. Now, let us return to London, to a cold evening, and the night of performance became a perfect crime. Chapter 1. The Death That Earned Applause. It was Holmes who insisted upon the opera. This in itself was remarkable. My friend's relationship with music was intense but narrow. He revered the violin with the devotion of a lover, tolerated the piano as a necessary companion to it, and regarded the human voice, when raised in song, with the same cool suspicion he reserved for spiritualists and liberal politicians. That he should procure 2 tickets to the premiere of Il Duello Fatale at the Royal Sovereign Theatre, and further, that he should present them to me over breakfast, with an expression suggesting I ought to be grateful, struck me as behaviour requiring explanation. "You detest opera," I said, turning the tickets over in my hand. They were fine seats, dress circle, 5th row centre. "I detest bad opera," Holmes corrected, reaching for his coffee. "I detest the convention that volume constitutes emotion, and that a man may be stabbed in the chest and yet sing about it for 4 minutes before having the decency to expire. But Morosini is a different order of composer. His orchestrations have genuine architectural intelligence. And the production is by the Royal Sovereign Company, whose stagecraft is, I am told, exceptional." "You are told by whom?" "By a programme note I read in yesterday's Telegraph, Watson. I am not above consulting the popular press when it concerns matters of no consequence." I should have recognised the studied indifference. Holmes never did anything for the reasons he first offered. But the evening was cold, my practice was quiet, and the prospect of velvet seats and gaslight held a certain appeal after a week of influenza cases and sprained ankles. I accepted, and the Royal Sovereign Theatre stood on the western edge of Haymarket, a monument to the confident extravagance of the previous decade. Its facade was Portland stone and pilasters, its interior a cathedral of crimson and gilt. We arrived at 6:30 to find the foyer already thronged. The premiere had attracted the full machinery of London society. Diamond brooches caught the gaslight. Top hats gleamed like a field of black silk. The air was thick with French perfume and the particular species of laughter that signifies people who wish to be seen laughing. Holmes moved through the crowd with his customary indifference to social atmosphere, his sharp grey eyes cataloguing faces and details with the mechanical efficiency of a telegraph clerk sorting messages. I had learned long ago that these public occasions were never wasted on him. Where I saw a glittering assembly, Holmes saw data. "The woman in the 3rd row," he murmured as we took our seats, "is conducting an affair with the gentleman 4 seats to her left. She has adjusted her hair 3 times since sitting down, always turning toward him. And her husband, who is seated beside her, has noticed nothing because he is absorbed in a racing form concealed inside his programme." Holmes. "And the man in box 5 is carrying a concealed weapon, a derringer, Watson, poorly hidden beneath an ill-fitting waistcoat. The fabric pulls when he leans forward, He's either expecting trouble or hoping to cause it. Neither possibility concerns us tonight. I glanced toward box 5, but could discern nothing unusual. Merely a stout, red-faced gentleman of middle years studying the stage through opera glasses. I had long since abandoned the attempt to see the world through Holmes's eyes. It was like trying to read by another man's candle. The house lights dimmed. The orchestra began the overture, a brooding, minor-key passage that built with restrained power toward a theme of considerable beauty. I found myself drawn in despite my limited musical education. Holmes sat very still beside me, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and I could not tell whether he was analyzing the composition or merely enduring it. The opera itself was a tale of honor and betrayal set in Renaissance Verona. Two noblemen, once brothers in arms, driven apart by love and ambition. The libretto was in Italian, which I followed imperfectly, but the staging was vivid enough that the narrative required no translation. The sets were extraordinary. Towering painted flats depicting moonlit courtyards and torchlit halls. Each scene change executed with a mechanical precision that drew murmurs of admiration from the audience. The baritone, Roderick Vane, commanded the stage with the authority of a man who had long understood his own magnetism. His voice was a rich, dark instrument, not the largest I had heard, but deployed with an intelligence and control that made every phrase feel inevitable. He played Count Orsini, the betrayed nobleman, and he inhabited the role with a conviction that blurred the line between performance and identity. Opposite him, the tenor Alaric Strand played the treacherous Donatello. Strand was a leaner, paler figure, technically proficient, but lacking Vane's natural command. Where Vane seemed to expand to fill the stage, its Strand appeared to contract, as if perpetually aware that the space was not quite his. Yet his voice had a piercing clarity in the upper register that complemented Vane's darkness, and the scenes between them crackled with a tension that felt less than entirely theatrical. The prima donna, Leonora Voss, was magnificent. She played Valentina, the woman whose love both men claimed, and she sang with a luminous intensity that silenced the habitual coughers and program rustlers in the stalls. Her voice had a quality I can only describe as architectural. Each note was placed with the precision of a mason setting stone, and the cumulative effect was something that transcended mere singing and became, for those minutes, something very close to truth. Holmes, I noticed, watched her with particular attention, not with the rapt absorption of an admirer. Holmes was immune to that species of enchantment, but with the focused scrutiny he reserved for evidence. The conductor, Julius Kemp, drove the orchestra with visible intensity. Even from the dress circle, I could see the sharp, almost aggressive economy of his gestures. A man who demanded precision and would accept nothing less. The tempi were brisk, perhaps excessively so. Holmes remarked during the first interval that Kemp was conducting the opera he wished Morosini had written, rather than the one he did, which I took to be a criticism, though with Holmes one could never be entirely certain. During that same interval, I observed a striking woman in the royal box, silver-haired, imperious, draped in black silk and pearls of considerable size. She surveyed the audience below with the proprietary satisfaction of a landowner reviewing her estates. "Mrs. Adela Hargrove," Holmes said, following my gaze. "The company's principal benefactress. Without her patronage, this theatre would be staging pantomime. She is aware of this, and so is everyone else. Acts 1 and 2 proceeded with mounting dramatic tension. The plot turned on a duel of honor. Count Orsini challenged Donatello to mortal combat, and the second act ended with both men swearing oaths of vengeance before a chorus of horrified courtiers. It was conventional, perhaps, but the music elevated it beyond its materials, and I found myself genuinely anticipating the resolution. Holmes was less patient. He shifted in his seat, drummed his fingers silently on the armrest, and at one point extracted a pencil and made a small notation on the back of his program. What it was, I could not see. When I asked if he was enjoying himself, he replied, "The orchestration of the second act finale is superb. The staging of the third will be more interesting still." I did not understand what he meant until later. Act 3 opened with a scene of brooding preparation. Orsini alone in his chambers, singing of betrayal and resolve, while servants laid out his weapons. Then the scene shifted to the great hall, and the duel began. It was, I must confess, the finest piece of stage combat I had ever witnessed. The choreography was elaborate and technically demanding. A sequence of attacks, parries, riposts, and counterattacks that moved the two men across the full width of the stage. The blades caught the limelight and threw sparks of reflection across the painted walls. The orchestra drove beneath them with relentless momentum. 800 people held their breath. The sequence built to its climax. Strand's Donatello, pressed backward by Vane's furious assault, found his footing and launched a final desperate counterattack. A lunging thrust delivered at full extension across the diagonal of the stage. The blade struck Vane squarely in the chest. Vane staggered. His hand went to the wound. He looked down at the blade, then up at his adversary, and in his face was an expression of what? Surprise, certainly, but something else. Something I could not name in that moment, but which returned to me many times in the days that followed. He fell. The music swelled. The chorus sang their lamentation. Strand stood over the fallen man, his blade still extended, his face a mask of theatrical horror. And the audience erupted. I have seldom heard such applause. The stalls rose to their feet. The galleries roared. Hands beat together in a thunder of approval that shook the chandeliers. It was, by any measure, a triumph. But Vane did not rise. The curtain began its descent, and still Vane lay motionless on the boards. I saw Strand glance downward, his expression shifting from performance to uncertainty. A figure emerged from the wings, a slight, efficient man in dark clothing, who moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to navigating the backstage world without being noticed. He knelt beside Vane. I saw him touch the baritone's throat, then his wrist. Then he looked up toward the wings and made a sharp gesture. Urgent, controlled, unmistakable. The curtain came down. The applause continued for several seconds. The audience, still captive to the illusion, believing the delay was part of the spectacle. Then a murmur began, threading through the stalls like a cold draft. Something was wrong. I turned to Holmes. He had not moved. He had not applauded. He sat with his hands still steepled, his eyes fixed on the point where the curtain met the stage, and his expression was one I knew intimately. The expression of a man who has seen something that no one else has seen and is deciding what it means. "Holmes," I said. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke very quietly, almost to himself. "The body knows the difference between pretense and puncture, Watson. even when the mind does not. What do you mean? I mean that there was a delay between the thrust and the response. Half a second, perhaps less. In rehearsed stage combat, the victim begins his reaction simultaneously with the strike, or even fractionally before it, to sell the illusion to the audience. Vane reacted after. His body responded to genuine trauma. The timing was wrong. He paused. Or rather, it was right, and that is considerably worse. The murmur in the house had become a commotion. A woman screamed. Voices called for a doctor. Holmes rose from his seat and buttoned his coat. "Come, Watson," he said. "I believe the evening's true performance is about to begin." Chapter 2. A Tragedy Too Real. The backstage of the Royal Sovereign Theatre was a world designed never to be seen, where the auditorium offered velvet and gilt and the soft democracy of gaslight. The wings presented raw brick, naked iron, and the brutal economics of illusion. Ropes thick as a man's wrist hung in ordered ranks from the fly gallery. Painted flats leaned against the walls like discarded playing cards. The air smelled of size, turpentine, and the particular staleness of spaces that exist in permanent twilight. We reached the stage through a service corridor that Holmes navigated with a confidence suggesting prior familiarity, though when he had found occasion to study the architecture of the Royal Sovereign, I could not imagine. The corridor was already crowded with company members in various states of costume and distress. A woman in Renaissance silks sat on an upturned crate, weeping quietly. Two men in doublets argued in rapid Italian near a rack of halberds. A boy of perhaps 15, a page in the third act, and judging by his velvet tunic, stood against the wall with the rigid, white-faced stillness of someone trying very hard not to be sick. Holmes moved through them without pause, and I followed in his wake as I had done so many times before, through fog-choked alleys, across rain-swept moors, into rooms where violence had left its signature on the walls. The geography changed. The essential dynamic did not. Holmes advanced. I followed, and somewhere ahead, a dead man waited. The stage itself was still lit. The limelights had not been struck, and they threw their harsh white glare across the boards with an indifference that felt almost offensive. Roderick Vane lay where he had fallen, centre stage, slightly left of the chalk mark that indicated his final position. He was on his back, one arm flung outward and the other pressed against his chest. His eyes were open. His expression had settled into something that was not quite surprise and not quite pain, but rather a kind of profound bewilderment, as if death had arrived in a form he had not anticipated and could not quite credit. The theatre's house doctor, a small, flustered man introduced to us as Dr. Lewin, was kneeling beside the body. He had loosened Vane's costume at the throat and was in the process of a fumbling examination that Holmes watched with barely concealed impatience. Standing a few feet away, arms folded, his face composed into an expression of grave concern, was the man I had seen emerge from the wings, the slight, efficient figure who had been first to reach the body. "That is the stage manager," Holmes said to me, his voice pitched below the surrounding commotion. "Edmund Hale. Note the position of his hands." I looked. Hale's arms were crossed, his hands tucked against his sleeves. He wore dark leather gloves, working gloves, the kind a man might wear when handling ropes and hardware. There was nothing remarkable about them that I could see. "What of his hands?" I asked. Nothing. Yet. Holmes moved toward the body. Dr. Lewin looked up with evident relief at the sight of another medical man. Dr. Watson, is it? Thank God. I'm a general man. I haven't dealt with a wound like this in 20 years. Allow me, I said, and knelt beside the body. I conducted my examination with the thoroughness that years of association with Holmes had instilled in me. I had learned that a body was not merely a clinical subject but a document, and that the manner of a man's death, read correctly, I could speak with a clarity the living often lacked. The wound was in the left chest, between the fourth and fifth ribs, slightly lateral to the sternum. I unbuttoned the costume, a richly embroidered doublet, now dark with blood, and exposed the injury. The entry point was narrow, clean-edged, and deep. I probed gently with a gloved finger and met no resistance until I reached a depth that told me everything I needed to know. The blade had passed through the intercostal space without deflection, penetrating the pericardial sac and almost certainly lacerating the left ventricle. Death would have followed within minutes, perhaps less. Holmes, I said, sitting back on my heels. This wound was not made by a prop weapon. Describe it precisely, Watson. Omit nothing. The penetration is clean and uninterrupted. A single thrust along a direct linear axis, with no lateral deviation whatsoever. The edges of the wound are smooth, consistent with an extremely sharp blade of narrow cross-section. There is no bruising around the entry point that would suggest a blunted or resistant instrument. And the depth. I paused, aware that several company members were within earshot. The depth is sufficient to reach the heart. What does the nature of the wound tell you about the manner of its delivery? I considered this. A theatrical blow, even one delivered with a sharpened prop, would typically show some evidence of hesitation, a slight angle of deviation as the attacker unconsciously adjusts, surface scoring where the blade meets resistance and the wielder compensates. This wound has none of that. It was delivered with full mechanical commitment along a single precise vector, like a surgeon's incision or a soldier's thrust. Good. What else? I looked again at the body. Vane's arms, his shoulders, his hands. And then I saw what Holmes was waiting for me to see. There are no defensive injuries, I said slowly. No bruising on the forearms, no abrasions on the hands. His shoulders are square. He didn't twist or turn away from the blow. He didn't flinch. Not even reflexively. Not even reflexively. The human body has involuntary responses to perceived threat. The arms rise, the shoulders rotate, the torso contracts. Even a man who has been told the blade is harmless will show some trace of the flinch response when steel approaches his chest at speed. There is nothing, and he stood and received the blow without the slightest physical protest. Because he trusted the blade completely. He believed, with absolute conviction, that what was coming toward him could not hurt him. He had rehearsed this moment. He knew the choreography. He expected a prop, and he received his expectation with his body open and his guard entirely down. Holmes straightened. His gaze moved slowly across the stage. The chalk marks, the scuffed boards, the position of the prop table in the wings, the angles of the limelights. He was measuring, I knew, constructing the spatial geometry of the scene with the precision of a surveyor plotting a map. "Mr. Hale," Holmes said, without turning. The stage manager stepped forward. Up close, he was a man of unremarkable appearance, medium height, Lean build, our brown hair greying at the temples. His face had the particular quality of faces that are difficult to recall after one has looked away. Pleasant, regular, defined by no single memorable feature. His eyes, however, were alert and steady. He met Holmes's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Holmes, I've read about you, of course. I wish the circumstances were different." "As do I. One question for the moment, Mr. Hale. Who placed the weapons on the prop table this evening?" "I did," Hale replied without hesitation. "As I always do. It is part of my pre-show routine. I check every prop against the manifest, place them on the designated tables, and confirm their positions with the relevant performers." "At what time?" "Approximately 5:45, an hour and a quarter before curtain." "And the weapons were drawn from where?" "The prop storage case. It's a locked cabinet in the storage corridor, stage left, behind the second fly gallery. I hold the master key." "You alone?" "The company director has a duplicate, but he has been in Edinburgh for a fortnight. For all practical purposes, yes. I alone." Holmes nodded, a single, measured inclination of the head that communicated nothing of his thoughts. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. I may have further questions." "Of course. I am entirely at your disposal." Hale withdrew. He moved with the practiced economy of a man accustomed to navigating cluttered spaces in near darkness. Each step deliberate, each turn of the body calibrated to avoid contact with the scenery and rigging that crowded the wings. He made no sound, and it occurred to me that in the chaotic aftermath of the killing, with company members weeping and shouting and stumbling over one another, Hale was the only person backstage who appeared entirely in command of himself. I mentioned this to Holmes. "He seems remarkably composed." "He does," Holmes said, and offered nothing further. Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 constables and a police surgeon, whose examination of the body added nothing to what I had already established. Lestrade was in his familiar mode, brisk, competent within his limits, and eager to impose order on confusion. He sealed the theatre exits, posted a constable at each, and established an interview room in the conductor's green room backstage. "Right," Lestrade said, surveying the scene with the satisfied air of a man who believes the essentials are straightforward. The tenor killed the baritone. Blade in the chest, 800 witnesses. Motive to be established but hardly necessary given the physical evidence. I'll have a full confession by morning." "You may indeed," Holmes said mildly, "though I wonder whether it will be the correct one." "Meaning?" "Meaning that the obvious solution is the most dangerous kind, Inspector. Not because it is wrong, but because it is so nearly right that the distance between it and the truth may escape notice entirely." Lestrade frowned. "You have a different theory?" "I have no theory. I have 2 observations that do not fit your narrative, and a question that your narrative does not answer." "And those are?" Holmes held up a finger. "First, the wound. Dr. Watson will confirm that it was delivered with a mechanical precision inconsistent with murderous intent. A man who knows he is driving a real blade into human flesh will betray it. In his grip, in his posture, in the micro-hesitations of a body that understands it is committing violence. There are none. The blow was rehearsed, mechanically perfect, undifferentiated from every previous performance of the same choreography." A second finger. "Second, the victim showed no defensive response. None. A man facing a genuine attack, even one disguised as performance, will flinch. The body's autonomic responses cannot be entirely suppressed. Vane did not flinch because he had no reason to flinch. He died trusting the blade. And the question? Holmes lowered his hand. If the man who held the blade did not know it was real, and the man who received it did not know it was real, then who made it real? That, Inspector, is the question your narrative does not address. Lestrade opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the body with an expression that suggested the evening had become considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. Holmes turned to me. Watson, I shall require your medical expertise further before the night is out. There is a prop storage room behind the second fly gallery that I wish to examine. But first, he glanced toward the corridor where the company members waited. First, I should like to speak with the man who held the blade, the man who thinks he is a murderer and is not. That particular species of anguish is instructive, if one knows how to read it. He set off toward the green room with his long, purposeful stride, and I followed, aware, as I always was in such moments, that the world had shifted beneath my feet. An hour ago, I had been watching an opera. Now I was watching Holmes, and the performance had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Man Who Held the Blade. The conductor's green room was a narrow, wood-panelled space that smelled of rosin and cigarette smoke. A battered upright piano stood against one wall, its lid scarred with the white rings of 100 coffee cups. Musical scores were stacked on every surface, on the piano, on the chairs, on the floor in precarious columns that leaned against one another like drunken soldiers. A gas bracket on the far wall threw a yellowish light that flattered nothing. Alaric Strand sat in the only cleared chair, a straight-backed wooden seat that had been placed in the centre of the room with the unsubtle geometry of an interrogation. He was still in costume, the embroidered doublet of Donatello, now dark with sweat at the collar and beneath the arms. His stage makeup had begun to crack and separate, giving his face a fractured quality, as though the man beneath the performance were breaking through. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and the smell of whiskey reached me from the doorway. Lestrade had already conducted a preliminary interview, blunt, efficient, and predicated on the assumption that Strand was his man. Holmes had observed this from the corridor without comment, leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes half closed in the attitude of perfect stillness that I had learned, over the years, and to recognize as his most intense concentration. Now Lestrade had withdrawn to arrange the transport of the body, and Holmes entered the room as though he had been invited. "Mr. Strand," Holmes said, settling into the chair opposite, with an easy, almost casual grace. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. I should like to ask you some questions, not as an officer of the law, but as an interested observer." Strand looked up. His gaze was unfocused, swimming with the particular mixture of shock and alcohol that produces a dangerous transparency, the state in which men say more than they intend, because the mechanisms of caution have been dissolved. "I killed him," Strand said. His voice was hoarse, not with grief, I thought, but with the strain of a man who has been repeating the same sentence to himself for the past hour and cannot make it feel real. I felt the blade go in. I felt the resistance. You don't forget that. The way it stops and then doesn't stop. "You felt resistance," Holmes said quietly. Where precisely? In my arm, in my wrist. The choreography is a straight thrust, full extension from the shoulder, the wrist locked, the blade travelling on a flat plane. I've done it 40 times in rehearsal. Every time there's nothing. The prop hits costume and compresses. There's a soft stop. Tonight there was... He faltered, swallowed. There was a moment when the blade caught, like pushing through heavy fabric. And then it went forward, and there was no more resistance, and I knew. I knew before he fell. I knew from the way the sword felt in my hand. But you did not know before the thrust. No. You did not examine the weapon before the performance. Strachan shook his head. I collected it from the prop table during the scene change before Act 3, carried it on stage, set it on the banquet table. That's part of the blocking. Donatello takes the sword from the table when the duel begins. I didn't. I held it for perhaps 10 seconds before I put it down. And in those 10 seconds you noticed nothing unusual? Nothing about the weight, the balance, the feel of the grip? Strand stopped. His jaw tightened. I was not at my best. I had taken a drink, more than one drink, before the performance. My nerves have been... He broke off and stared at the floor. Holmes let the silence hold. It was a technique I had observed many times. The strategic deployment of quiet, which in the hands of a lesser interrogator would have been mere awkwardness, but which Holmes wielded with the precision of a scalpel. Most people cannot tolerate silence. They fill it. They confess into it. They offer the very details they have been trying to withhold, simply to stop the emptiness pressing against them. Strand filled it. My hands shake, he said, very quietly. Before every performance now. They didn't used to. 3 months ago, 4, I was steady. I could hold a note for 16 bars without a tremor in my diaphragm. Now I drink before I go on, because if I don't, my left hand shakes badly enough that the audience can see it from the stalls. I noticed Holmes's gaze drop to Strand's hands. They rested on his knees, the left trembling faintly, a fine oscillation visible in the fingertips. The right was still, perfectly still, his sword hand. I understood then what Holmes was cataloguing. The tremor was neurological or psychological, affecting the non-dominant hand. But the right, the trained hand, the hand that had held a blade and driven it through a man's chest, retained its disciplined steadiness. The body of a performer, compartmentalized. His nerves were failing him. His technique was not. The drinking, Holmes said. When did it begin? After the casting was announced, when I learned I would be opposite Vane for an entire season. You and Vane were not friendly. Strand produced a sound that was not quite a laugh. Friendly? No, Mr. Holmes, we were not friendly. Roderick Vane regarded me as furniture, unscenery with a voice. He told the company director, in front of the full ensemble, at a dinner after the autumn gala, that I was competent but forgettable. Those were his words. Competent but forgettable. Do you know what that does to a man in my profession? Competence is the minimum. Forgettable is the death sentence. I have spent 12 years building a career that should have put me in the front rank. And Vane, with a word, with a phrase tossed off between the fish course and the sorbet, reduced it to nothing. You resented him. I despised him. Half the company despised him. I was simply the most honest about it. I said things I should not have said. In the wings, in the pub after rehearsals. I said I wished he would choke on his own high C. I said the company would be better off without him. I said, He stopped himself. Oh, I said a great many things that sound rather different now that the man is dead. Did you wish him dead? I wished him gone. There is a difference, Mr. Holmes, though I recognize that the distinction may be difficult to credit at this particular moment. Holmes regarded him steadily. Mr. Strand, I should like you to demonstrate the choreography of the fatal sequence, the full movement, from the preparation through the thrust. Strand stared at him. You want me to? I want to see the movement as your body performs it, not as you describe it, but as your muscles execute it. Will you do this? Strand rose slowly. He was unsteady for a moment, the whiskey and the shock combining to undermine his balance. But then something shifted in his bearing. The performer's discipline reasserted itself. He planted his feet in a fencing stance, his right arm extended as though holding an invisible blade, his weight distributed with the unconscious precision of a man who had rehearsed this motion until it lived in his bones. The sequence begins with a retreat, he said. 3 steps back, parrying high, then a lateral shift, right to clear the center line. Orsini, vain, follows with a crosscut. Donatello deflects, drops his point beneath Orsini's guard, and delivers the killing thrust. Straight line from the right shoulder, full extension, wrist locked, blade flat. He performed it. The invisible thrust drove forward with a clean, committed extension. Arm, shoulder, and hip aligned in a single mechanical action. There was no hesitation, no hitch, no pulled motion. The movement terminated at full reach, and Strand held the position for a moment before dropping his arm. Again, please, Holmes said. Strand repeated it. Identical. The same footwork, the same arm angle, the same terminal extension. Once more. A third time. Unchanged. The movement was as fixed and invariable as the motion of a piston. A mechanical reproduction of a rehearsed sequence, executed with the precision of a body that had committed the choreography to a level below conscious thought. Holmes turned to the doorway, where a small, immaculately groomed man had appeared. Sharp, dark eyes, waxed moustache, a leather-bound notebook pressed against his chest like a breviary. This was Delacroix, the company choreographer, whom Holmes had evidently summoned during Lestrade's earlier questioning. Monsieur Delacroix, Holmes said, you have observed, Mr. Strand's demonstration. How does it compare to the rehearsed choreography? Delacroix did not hesitate. It is identical, monsieur. The foot placement, the line of the arm, the angle of extension, the commitment of the wrist. All precisely as I choreographed and as Mr. Strand has performed in every rehearsal since we began working the scene 6 weeks ago. There is no deviation, not the smallest. In your professional experience, Monsieur Delacroix, if a performer knew that the blade in his hand was real and that his thrust would inflict genuine harm, would you expect some variation in the execution, however slight? Delacroix considered this with the seriousness of a man being asked to testify on a matter of professional doctrine. Without question, monsieur, the body cannot lie as fluently as the mind. A man who knows he is about to drive a blade into living flesh will alter his movement, perhaps unconsciously, but inevitably. A tightened grip, a fractional pulling of the thrust to control penetration depth, a micro hesitation at the moment of full extension. The body resists. It always resists. I have choreographed stage combat for 20 years, and I have seen even experienced swordsmen flinch when a blade is sharper than expected. Mr. Strand's movement shows none of this. It is a rehearsed motion, executed with rehearsed commitment. If this man knew the blade was real, monsieur, then he is not merely an actor. He is something beyond human. Thank you, Monsieur Delacroix. That will be all for the moment. The choreographer withdrew. Holmes sat in silence for a time, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that existed only in the architecture of his own thoughts. Strand remained standing, his arms at his sides, the tremor in his left hand clearly visible now. "Mr. Holmes," Strand said at last, "am I to be arrested?" "That is Inspector Lestrade's prerogative, not mine. But I will tell you what I told the inspector. You performed a rehearsed motion with mechanical fidelity. The killing was not in the man who held the blade. It was in the conditions surrounding him." Holmes rose. "The blade was not yours, Mr. Strand. The angle was not yours. The geometry that turned your rehearsed thrust into a killing stroke was arranged by someone who understood precisely what your body would do and engineered the circumstances to make your discipline into a weapon. You were not the murderer. You were the instrument." Strand's face did something complicated, a sequence of micro-expressions that cycled through disbelief, desperate hope, and a species of anguish that was, in its way, worse than guilt. Because if Holmes was right, then Strand had not killed Vane through malice or negligence. He had been used. His competence, the very quality Vane had dismissed as unremarkable, had been the mechanism of the man's destruction. The precision that should have been his professional pride had been turned, without his knowledge or consent, into the instrument of death. "Who?" Strand whispered. "That," Holmes said, "is what I intend to discover." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "One further question, Mr. Strand. You collected the rapier from the prop table. Did anyone else handle it before you?" "Not that I saw. It was laid out in the usual position, stage left, second table, beside the goblets for the banquet scene. Hale sets the props before every performance. I assumed he had placed it there as always." "You assumed?" "I had no reason to think otherwise." Holmes nodded. "No," he said, "you did not." We left Strand in the green room, diminished, bewildered, and clutching at Holmes's words as a drowning man clutches at timber. In the corridor, Holmes walked in silence for some moments before speaking. "A man who intended to kill would betray it in his body, Watson. A tightened grip, a pulled thrust, a fractional pause before commitment. There was none of that. Eddie Strand performed a rehearsed motion with the precision of a mechanical instrument. And that precision is precisely what made him the ideal unwitting weapon. Whoever designed this murder understood that. They chose Strand not despite his discipline, but because of it. Then who? Patience, Watson. We have established what this crime is not. It is not a crime of passion, not an act of rage performed in the heat of the moment by a man who hated his victim. It is a mechanism, a device constructed from human components, each performing their function without understanding the whole. And a mechanism, Watson, requires an engineer." He paused at the junction of two corridors. To the left, the noise of the company, voices weeping, the officious tones of constables taking statements. To the right, silence and shadow, the deeper backstage, and where the machinery of the theatre lived. Holmes turned right. "Come," he said. "I should like to see the world behind the curtain." Chapter 4. The World Behind the Curtain. The deeper backstage of the Royal Sovereign Theatre was a labyrinth of functions stripped of all ornament. Here, the illusions that enchanted the audience were revealed in their naked mechanics. Ropes and pulleys and counterweights, wooden frames and canvas flats, buckets of paint and jars of rabbit skin glue ranged along shelves like an apothecary's stock. The corridors narrowed as we moved further from the stage, the ceilings lowered, and the gaslight thinned to a sullen amber glow that left the corners in permanent shadow. It was a place built for people who were never meant to be seen, and it had the corresponding character: utilitarian, cramped, and profoundly indifferent to the comfort of its inhabitants. Holmes moved through this territory with the alert, unhurried attention of a naturalist entering a new ecosystem. He touched nothing. He paused frequently, not to examine any single object, but to absorb the spatial relationships between them. The distance from the prop storage corridor to the stage, the sight lines from the wings to the dressing rooms, the placement of the gas brackets, and the pools of shadow they created. He was mapping the geometry of the building the way he might map the geometry of a crime scene. Because I was beginning to understand, they were one and the same. We visited the dressing rooms first. They were arranged along a corridor behind the fly gallery, a row of narrow doors, each bearing a brass nameplate. The principal performers occupied the rooms closest to the stage. The chorus shared a larger communal space at the far end. The air smelled of grease paint, powder, and the particular floral heaviness of theatrical perfume applied in quantity. Holmes knocked at the first door. A voice, low, controlled, musical even in speech, invited us to enter. Leonora Voss sat before her dressing mirror in a silk wrapper, her stage costume hanging on a wooden stand beside her like the shed skin of a more magnificent creature. The dressing room was small but fastidiously arranged. Flowers in a cut glass vase, a velvet shawl draped over the chaise, a row of cosmetic pots aligned with military precision along the shelf beneath the mirror. She had removed her stage makeup, and without it, her face was older and more interesting. Strong bones, intelligent eyes, a mouth that suggested both determination and the habit of concealment. She looked at Holmes without surprise. "Mr. Holmes, I wondered when you would come. You expected me." "I expected someone. A man has died. Questions must be asked. You are, I am told, the man who asks the questions no one else thinks to ask. A generous assessment. I shall try to deserve it." Holmes took the single wooden chair without being invited, a liberty that from anyone else would have constituted rudeness, but which Holmes performed with such unself-conscious authority that it seemed merely the natural order of things asserting itself. I remained standing near the door, notebook in hand. "You were acquainted with Mr. Vane," Holmes began. "We all were. One cannot spend a season in close professional collaboration without acquaintance. I meant something more specific than professional proximity, Miss Voss." A pause. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap with the stillness of a woman accustomed to being observed, moved fractionally. The right closing over the left, a containment gesture. Roderick and I were close. For a time, the nature of opera demands emotional intimacy between performers. One cannot sing a love duet convincingly without some foundation of genuine feeling. And was the feeling genuine? It was complicated. Holmes let this stand without challenge. He studied her face the way a jeweler studies a stone, turning it in the light of his attention, looking for the flaw that would reveal the interior structure. Whatever he saw, he kept to himself. "You were in your dressing room for the full hour before curtain," he said. "Is that correct?" "That is correct. I was warming my voice, reviewing my score, and completing my makeup. My dresser, Mrs. Belling, was with me for part of that time." "For all of it?" "She left to attend to Miss Carrick, the mezzo, at approximately 5:30. I was alone after that until the quarter-hour call." "And you did not leave the dressing room during that interval?" "I did not." Holmes nodded pleasantly. He asked 2 or 3 further questions of no apparent significance, about the company's rehearsal schedule, about the selection of Il Duello Fatale for the season premiere, about her opinion of Morosini's composition. Voss answered with practiced grace, offering precisely enough to satisfy without revealing anything of substance. She was, I reflected, a woman who had spent her professional life performing, and the performance did not end when the curtain came down. I watched her as Holmes spoke. There was something in her bearing that I could not quite identify, a tension beneath the composure, like a wire drawn taut inside a velvet case. Her posture was perfect, her voice controlled, her expression appropriately sorrowful. But there was a quality to her stillness that troubled me. It was not the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of a woman holding herself together through an act of will so intense that any movement, however small, risked shattering the entire construction. Holmes noticed it too. As we left the dressing room, he said quietly, "She has been preparing for something, Watson. Her grief is real, but it is not the grief of surprise. She expected a catastrophe. The question is whether she expected this particular one." We proceeded to the conductor's office, a cluttered room on the opposite side of the corridor, its walls papered with concert programs and annotated scores. Julius Kemp was waiting for us, though waiting perhaps overstates the patience involved. He was pacing. The room was barely large enough to permit it. 4 steps turn, 4 steps turn, and the effect was of a caged animal whose enclosure had been designed by someone with a malicious sense of economy. Kemp was a man of perhaps 55, with the wiry build and restless energy of someone whose body was merely a vehicle for his nervous system. His hair was grey, swept back from a high forehead scored with deep lines. His hands, a conductor's hands, long-fingered and expressive, were never still. They conducted invisible orchestras, punctuated his speech with emphatic gestures, drummed on tabletops with the compulsive rhythm of a man whose internal metronome never ceased. "This is a disaster," Kemp said, before Holmes had fully entered the room. "An unmitigated disaster. The season is destroyed. The reputation of this company, built over decades, Mr. Holmes, decades, will be reduced to a grotesque headline in tomorrow's penny papers. Death at the opera. Murder most musical. I can already see the vultures circling." "A man is dead, Mr. Kemp," I said, with more sharpness than I intended. "I am aware of that, Doctor. I was standing 10 feet below him when it happened. I heard the sound. Do you know what a blade entering a human body sounds like from an orchestra pit? It doesn't sound like anything in a score. It sounds like a mistake, a wrong note, a sound that should not exist in the music. I heard it, and I knew." "You knew immediately?" Holmes asked. "I knew something was wrong. The acoustic was different. The blade, the sound of the blades during the duel, had been wrong all evening, now that I think of it. Fuller, more resonant. I dismissed it during the performance because one does not stop conducting to investigate anomalies in the percussion of stage combat. But yes, it was different. Holmes filed this observation with a fractional narrowing of his eyes that I recognized as significant interest. Mr. Kemp, I should like to discuss your relationship with Mr. Vane. The pacing stopped. Kemp turned to face Holmes with the abruptness of a man who has walked into a wall. My relationship with Vane was professional and financial. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences Holmes engineered with suspects. This was the silence of a man calculating, rapidly, desperately, how much was already known and how much could still be concealed. I see you have been thorough, Kemp said at last. Yes, Vane and I had a joint investment, a planned concert hall, the new Philharmonic, to be built on a site in Clerkenwell. It was to be my legacy, a permanent venue for orchestral music, free from the compromises of shared theatrical spaces. Vane provided the capital, I provided the vision, and the management of the funds. I managed the project accounts. Naturally, Vane was a singer, not a businessman. How much of Mr. Vane's investment remains in the project accounts, Mr. Kemp? Another silence, longer this time. Kemp's hands, which had been conducting their invisible symphony throughout the conversation, went still. There have been expenses, he said carefully. Architectural consultations, site surveys, legal fees. The building trade is not inexpensive. I did not ask about expenses. I asked about the balance. Kemp sat down, not in a chair, but on the edge of his desk, as though his legs had made the decision independently of his will. He looked, in that moment, like a man whose internal metronome had finally stopped. Vane was threatening to withdraw, he said quietly. He had engaged an accountant to audit the project finances. He said, he told me last week, that if the audit revealed mismanagement, he would go public. He would ruin me. And would the audit have revealed mismanagement? It would have revealed discrepancies, expenditures that were not entirely aligned with the project's requirements. You embezzled from the joint venture, Holmes said. It was not a question. Kemp's face underwent a series of transitions, indignation, calculation, and finally the grey resignation of a man who understands that the game is finished. I had debts, personal debts, gambling. I am not proud of it. The money was there, and the project was moving slowly, and I told myself I would replace it before anyone noticed. I did not. And now Vane is dead, and the audit will proceed regardless, and I am... He spread his hands. I am ruined either way. You had reason to want Vane silenced, Holmes said. I had reason to want Vane's audit silenced. That is not the same thing. The distinction, Mr. Kemp, is more easily maintained when one's victim has not been stabbed through the heart during one's own performance. Kemp flinched. I was in the orchestra pit. 20 musicians will confirm it. I could not have... The orchestra pit connects to backstage, Holmes interrupted. There is a maintenance hatch. I observed it during my preliminary examination of the stage. It is located beneath the stage right wing, accessible from the pit through a narrow passage between the first violin section and the wall. Kemp stared at him. You think I climbed through a hatch, swapped a prop sword for a real one and climbed back, all during a performance I was conducting? I think nothing, Mr. Kemp. I observe and I verify. Holmes rose. Watson, if you would accompany me, I should like to examine that hatch. We descended to the orchestra pit through a narrow staircase at the side of the house. The pit was a cramped, subterranean space. Music stands packed shoulder to shoulder, chairs arranged with the geometric precision that orchestral seating demands. The smell of rosin, valve oil, and human exertion lingered in the close air. I could see, against the far wall beneath the stage right wing, a small wooden hatch set into the brickwork at floor level, perhaps 3 feet square, with iron hinges and a sliding bolt. Holmes knelt beside it. He examined the bolt first. A simple iron mechanism on the backstage side, operable only from within the passage or from backstage. He ran his finger along the bolt surface and studied the result. Dust, he said, undisturbed. And here, old paint. The bolt was last painted over during a general maintenance cycle, probably years ago. The paint is unbroken across the joint between bolt and bracket. This bolt has not been drawn in months, possibly longer. He examined the floor around the hatch. The boards were thick with the accumulated grime of a working theatrical space. Dust, rosin powder, scraps of paper. The area immediately before the hatch showed no disturbance. No scuff marks, no cleared patches, no indication that anyone had knelt or crouched here recently. The hatch has not been opened, Holmes said, straightening. Kemp was contained in the pit for the duration of the performance. His financial motive is genuine, his desperation is real, and his embezzlement will very likely send him to prison. But he did not kill Roderick Vane. He could not have. The physics of the building exclude him. We returned to the backstage corridor. Holmes paused at the junction where the passage branched. Left toward the stage, right toward the prop storage area and Hale's workshop. He stood very still for a moment, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something I could not hear. 4 suspects, Watson, he said. The tenor who held the blade, the conductor who had the motive, the prima donna who has the secret, and the stage manager who had the access. He began walking, not toward the stage, but deeper into the theatre, toward the prop storage room. We have eliminated the first 2, and let us see what the weapons themselves can tell us. Chapter 5. The blade that should not exist. The prop storage room was a windowless chamber at the end of a narrow corridor behind the second fly gallery. A passage so cramped that Holmes and I were obliged to walk in single file, our shoulders brushing scenery flat stacked against the walls like the pages of some enormous disassembled book. The gas bracket at the corridor's entrance provided the only illumination, and by the time we reached the storage room door, we were navigating by the light of the candle Holmes had procured from a stagehand, a stub of tallow in a tin holder that threw jumping shadows across the brickwork. The room itself was surprisingly orderly, where the corridors backstage had the chaotic, unimprovised character of spaces pressed into service beyond their original design. The prop storage room bore the unmistakable imprint of a disciplined mind. Weapons were racked along the left wall in ascending order of size. Daggers, short swords, rapiers, broadswords, a ceremonial halberd. Goblets, plates and candlesticks occupied shelf compartments on the right. At the far end, a heavy wooden cabinet stood against the wall, the locked prop case from which the performance weapons were drawn. Above it, pinned to the wall with brass tacks, was a handwritten manifest listing every item in the case, its condition, and the date of its last inspection. The handwriting was small, precise, and perfectly uniform. Hale's work, Holmes observed, studying the manifest. A meticulous man. Every entry dated, every item accounted for. And this is not mere professional diligence, Watson. This is a man who derives satisfaction from control, from the knowledge that every object in his domain is exactly where he placed it, performing exactly the function he assigned to it. Holmes produced the key he had obtained from Lestrade, Hale's master key, surrendered without protest during the initial interviews, and opened the prop case. Inside, arrayed in fitted velvet compartments, lay the remaining stage weapons for Il Duello Fatale. 3 rapiers, 2 daggers, and a short sword. Each rested in its designated slot. One slot, second from the left in the upper row, was empty. The killing blade has been retained by the police surgeon, Holmes said. But Lestrade, at my request, has left it in the theatre for the evening. It is in the green room, under constabulary supervision. Watson, would you be so good as to retrieve it? Handle it by the guard, not the grip. I went and returned with the weapon, carrying it as instructed. In the harsh light of the green room, under the gaze of a bored constable, it had looked like what it was, a sword. Here in the storage room, laid alongside its counterparts, the difference was immediately apparent. The prop rapiers were elegant approximations, aluminum alloy blades with a dull silvery finish, designed to catch the limelight convincingly at a distance of 20 feet. They were light in the hand, flexible, with blunted tips capped in small rubber nubs, painted to match the metal. The grips were wound leather over wooden cores, the guards stamped brass, the pommels hollow. They were objects designed to create the impression of lethality without the substance. Theatrical in every sense. The killing blade was something else entirely. It was steel, real steel, with the dense, blue-grey finish of a weapon that had been forged for purpose rather than appearance. The edge, while not razor-sharp, was ground to a functional point that would penetrate cloth, leather, and flesh with minimal resistance. The guard was solid, not stamped but cast, and the pommel was weighted for balance. It was, I recognized, a military rapier of a pattern common in the middle decades of the century. The kind of weapon a cavalry officer might have carried in the Crimea, or an infantry subaltern in India. Not an antique, not a relic. A functional instrument of violence maintained in serviceable condition. Hold the killing blade in your right hand, Holmes instructed me. Now, without putting it down, take one of the prop rapiers in your left. I did so. The difference was immediate and unmistakable. The prop rapier was featherlight, a toy, a confection. The killing blade had the settled, purposeful weight of a tool designed to do work. It sat in the hand with a gravity that the prop could not approximate. The balance point was different, further forward, pulling the tip downward with a gentle but insistent authority. The weight difference, I said. It must be considerable. Holmes had produced a small spring balance from his coat. One of the innumerable instruments he carried on his person during investigations, each appearing at the precise moment of its necessity, as if summoned by some conjurer's art. He weighed both blades in succession, holding each by the guard and reading the scale with his lens. The prop rapier weighs 410 grams. The killing blade weighs 615 grams, a difference of 205 grams, nearly half a pound. Holmes set the balance down and regarded the two weapons lying side by side on the velvet. A swordsman, or any man trained in stage combat, would know the difference the instant his hand closed around the grip. the balance is entirely different. The center of mass is displaced. The wrist must compensate. It is like picking up a glass of water and finding it filled with mercury. The question is not whether Strand noticed. The question is why he did not. He was drinking, I offered. His nerves were shattered. He said himself that he handled the weapon for only a few seconds before setting it down. Precisely. And those few seconds were spent in the frantic pre-scene rush of a man already compromised by alcohol and anxiety. He collected the weapon from the prop table, a routine action performed 100 times before, carried it the short distance to the on-stage banquet table and set it down. A practiced motion, executed without thought. The weight anomaly was there to be noticed, but the conditions conspired against noticing. And that, Watson, is not coincidence. That is design. Holmes replaced the weapons and closed the case. Then he did something I had not anticipated. He opened the case again, this time not with Hale's master key, but with deliberate slowness. Watching the key enter the lock, he withdrew it and examined the lock plate with his lens, inserted the key again, withdrew it, repeated the process 3 times, each time studying the brass plate surrounding the keyhole with an intensity that suggested he was reading a text written in a language only he could decipher. "The master key fits perfectly," he murmured. "No contact with the lock plate, no lateral pressure. The tolerances are exact." He straightened. "This lock has been opened by a second key, Watson. Look here." He held the candle close to the lock plate and offered me his lens. I looked. On the brass surface surrounding the keyhole, visible only under magnification and oblique candlelight, were a series of fine parallel scratches, hairline abrasions running vertically alongside the keyhole's edge. They were fresh. The exposed brass beneath the scratches was bright, unoxidized, distinct from the darker patina of the surrounding metal. "A key that was fractionally imprecise," Holmes said. "Marginally too wide, or with teeth cut 1/1000th of an inch beyond the optimal profile. Each insertion would produce these scratches as the key shaved against the lock plate. Hale's master key produces no such marks. I have just demonstrated this. A duplicate key was used, and a duplicate key means premeditation of a very deliberate order." He turned from the case and began a systematic search of the storage room. I watched as he examined shelves, moved boxes, lifted objects, and replaced them with the careful precision of a man who wished to leave no evidence of his own investigation. He spent particular attention on the workbench in the corner, Hale's domain, judging by the neatly arranged tools in the pot of glue, the coils of wire, and the small tin of brass tacks that matched those holding the manifest to the wall. Holmes opened each drawer, examined its contents, and closed it. When he reached the bottom drawer, a deep compartment containing what appeared to be offcuts of wood and scraps of leather, he paused. "Watson, your penknife, if you please." I handed it over. Holmes used the blade to pry gently at the base of the drawer. The bottom panel shifted, not fixed, but resting in a shallow rebate. He lifted it. Beneath it, in a space no more than an inch deep, lay a single brass key. Holmes extracted it with his handkerchief, holding it by the bow. He examined it under the lens, turning it slowly. "Recently cut," he said. "Machine made. A commercial locksmith, not a theatrical craftsman. The teeth show microscopic filings. Brass particles consistent with the interior of a brass lock mechanism. And here," He indicated a faint discoloration along the key's shaft. Oil, the same variety used to maintain the stage hardware. This key was made to open that case, and it was made by someone who took care to maintain it. He placed the key in an envelope produced from his coat. Lestrade will want this, though I suspect its owner will not be difficult to identify. We left the storage room. In the corridor, Holmes paused to listen. A habitual gesture, the momentary stillness of a predator registering the position of every other creature in its environment. From somewhere deeper in the theatre came the faint sound of voices. Lestrade's men, still conducting interviews. From the stage, silence. The performance was over, both of them. "There is one more person I wish to speak with tonight," Holmes said. "Not a suspect, a witness. A man whose ears may have caught what 800 pairs of eyes did not." We found the cellist in the orchestra's rehearsal room, a drafty space beneath the stage where the musicians stored their instruments and cases between performances. His name was Parrish, and he was a lean, anxious man of perhaps 40, with the permanently hunched posture of someone who had spent his adult life curled around a large stringed instrument. He was packing his cello into its case with the protective tenderness of a father putting a child to bed, and he startled visibly when Holmes addressed him. "Mr. Parrish, I understand you are seated in the orchestra near the stage right wing." "First chair cello, yes. Are closest to the wings of anyone in the pit, excepting the first violins on the opposite side. You have played this production in rehearsal, the duel scene. You have heard the sound of the stage weapons many times, a dozen times at least, more if you count the partial run-throughs. And tonight, was the sound of the blades as you expected?" Parrish stopped his packing. His hands rested on the cello's neck, and his expression shifted. The slightly unfocused look of a man consulting a sensory memory he has not yet fully processed. "No," he said slowly. "No, it was different. I noticed it during the first clash, when the blades meet in the opening parry. In rehearsal, the sound was lighter, a kind of thin, flat clatter. Aluminium, I suppose, though I didn't think about it in those terms. Tonight it was fuller, richer, more resonant. A ring, not a clatter. Almost musical, in fact, if one can call the sound of swords musical." He paused. "I remember thinking it sounded right, more realistic. I assumed they'd upgraded the props for the premiere." "You assumed?" "One does. Things change between the final rehearsal and opening night. Costumes are adjusted. Lighting cues are refined. I thought someone had decided the weapons should sound better for the paying audience." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "Mr. Parrish, you have, without knowing it, confirmed something of considerable importance. Steel contacting steel produces a harmonic resonance fundamentally distinct from aluminium striking aluminium. The acoustic signature you describe, fuller, richer, with a perceptible ring, is the sound of a genuine blade meeting a genuine blade. What you heard was not an upgrade. It was a substitution, and it occurred before the performance began." Parrish looked stricken. "You mean the real sword was there from the start? From the first scene, from the moment the weapon was placed on the prop table. The blade that killed Roderick Vane was in position before the curtain rose. The murder was not an act of impulse committed during the performance. It was engineered before the first note was played." We left Parrish to his cello and his troubled conscience. In the corridor, Holmes walked in silence for several paces before speaking. The architecture becomes clearer, Watson. The blade was swapped before the performance. Parrish's acoustic evidence confirms this independently of the physical evidence. I. Strand did not notice the substitution because the conditions of his collection were designed to prevent it. And the duplicate key, hidden in Hale's workbench, cut by a commercial locksmith, used to open a case that only Hale routinely accessed, tells us who performed the swap. Hale, I said. Hale had the access. Hale had the key. Hale had the knowledge of every prop, every lock, every inch of this backstage world. He is the one man in this building whose presence in the prop storage room at any hour would arouse no suspicion, because his presence there is not merely expected, it is required. Holmes paused at the corridor's end, where the passage opened onto the wings of the now darkened stage. The work lights had been extinguished. The great space lay in shadow, and the painted flats and hanging borders reduced to vague geometries in the residual glow of a single gas bracket, burning somewhere in the flies. But access and capability are not motive, Watson. A man does not forge a duplicate key, acquire a military blade, and engineer a murder of this precision merely because he can. There is a reason, and the reason, I suspect, lies not in the man who died, but in the woman who lied about where she was at 5:30. He turned from the darkened stage. Enough for tonight. Tomorrow we shall examine the geometry of the killing itself and discover why a 6-inch adjustment in stage blocking was the difference between theatre and murder. Chapter 6. The perfect illusion I slept poorly that night, poorly that, or the image of Vane's face, that expression of bewildered incomprehension, as his body registered what his mind could not accept, followed me through fitful dreams in which I stood in an empty theatre and watched a figure on stage die, again and again, while an audience of shadows applauded without cease. I woke before dawn, unrested, and found Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table with a cold cup of coffee, the morning papers spread before him, and the abstracted inward expression that indicated his mind had not paused during the hours I'd spent attempting to quiet mine. "The Times gives it 4 columns," he said without looking up. "The Telegraph 6. The Daily Chronicle has devoted its entire front page to speculation, most of it incorrect. Lestrade is quoted as saying an arrest is imminent, and which means he has not yet decided whom to arrest. And the reviews?" Holmes pushed a folded paper across the table. It was the Morning Post, open to the arts pages. The critic, one Archibald Fenwick, a name I vaguely recognised from Mary's occasional theatre programmes, had filed his review of the premiere before news of the death had fully circulated. The notice praised the production in extravagant terms. The staging was masterly. Voss's performance was incandescent, and the death scene, the scene in which a man had actually died, was singled out for particular admiration. The realism of Mr. Vane's final moments was startling in its conviction, Fenwick wrote. One almost believed one was witnessing a genuine death. Holmes set the paper down without expression. The fiction held, he said, 800 witnesses, and not one of them saw what was in front of their eyes. The most public murder in London's history, performed in full view of a sold-out house, and the Morning Critic praises its artistry. He rose. "Come, Watson, the theatre awaits, and today we shall read the stage as the murderer wrote it." We arrived at the Royal Sovereign shortly after 9 o'clock. The theatre had been sealed overnight by Lestrade's men. and a constable at the stage door admitted us with the weary resignation of a man who had been standing in the cold since midnight and no longer possessed the energy to question credentials. The interior was changed utterly from the previous evening. Without an audience, without gaslight, without the animating energy of performance, the auditorium was a hollow shell, a vast and chilly space that smelled of dust and extinguished wicks. The seats stretched away into shadow like rows of empty graves. The stage, lit now by the harsh white glare of the work lights, had the exposed, unforgiving quality of a surgical theatre. Every scuff, every stain, every imperfection visible in merciless detail. Holmes had summoned 3 people to the stage: Watson, myself, in the capacity of medical consultant and physical stand-in; Inspector Lestrade, who arrived with his collar turned up and his patience already thinning; and the choreographer Delacroix, who appeared in a beautifully cut grey overcoat with his leather-bound notebook pressed to his chest, and an expression of professional gravity that suggested he regarded the proceedings as a masterclass rather than a murder investigation. "Monsieur Delacroix," Holmes began, "I should like you to produce your master choreography notes for the Act 3 duel sequence, the original blocking, as you designed it, and as it was rehearsed." Delacroix opened his notebook. The pages were covered in a dense, precise notation that combined stick figure diagrams with arrows, numbers, and annotations in a mixture of French and English. He found the relevant section and held it open for Holmes's inspection. "The duel sequence is 32 bars of music," Delacroix explained, "divided into 4 phrases of 8 bars each. The first phrase is the opening engagement. Both men center stage, blades crossed, circling. The second is the escalation. Orsini drives Donatello stage left with a series of high attacks. The third is the reversal. Donatello recovers, shifts his weight, and begins his counterattack. The fourth is the climax, Donatello's final thrust. It is this last phrase that concerns us. Describe the original blocking for the final thrust." "In my design, Orsini, Mr. Vane, is positioned upstage right during the 4th phrase. He retreats along a diagonal line from center stage toward the upstage right corner, drawing Donatello after him. At bar 29, Donatello plants his right foot on the marked position. Here, he indicated a chalk cross on his diagram, and delivers the thrust on a flat line, full extension, wrist locked. The blade travels on a trajectory from Donatello's right shoulder toward Orsini's left shoulder. At the distance and angle prescribed, the thrust passes approximately 4 inches to the left of Orsini's torso. A clean miss is sold to the audience by Orsini's simultaneous reaction." "A miss," Holmes repeated. "Not a contact. Not a contact. The choreography is designed so that the blade never touches the body. The illusion of penetration is created by Orsini's physical acting. His hand goes to his chest. He staggers. He falls. The audience sees what it expects to see. In 12 years of choreographing stage combat, I have never designed a sequence in which the blade makes physical contact. The risk is unnecessary. The eye is easily deceived. But last night, the blade did make contact. It did, and it did so because the geometry was altered." Holmes turned to the stage floor. Under the work lights, the chalk marks of the original blocking were still faintly visible, scuffed by the performance, but not entirely obliterated. Holmes knelt and traced them with his finger, following the pattern of crosses and arrows that map the movements of the two performers across the boards. Here, he said, indicating a chalk cross near the upstage right area. This is Vane's prescribed position for the final thrust. Upstage right, approximately 8 feet from the center line and 4 feet from the rear curtain. Correct, Delacroix confirmed. And here, Holmes moved to a second mark, barely 6 inches from the first but displaced downstage and to the left. This mark was fresher, the chalk brighter, the line less scuffed. This is where Vane actually stood. Delacroix leaned forward. His mustache twitched. That is not my mark. I did not place that cross. No, someone altered the blocking, and Vane was moved approximately 6 inches downstage left from his prescribed position. A small adjustment, invisible to the audience, insignificant to the performers, and absolutely devastating in its consequences. Holmes straightened and turned to me. Watson, I require your assistance. Stand on the altered mark if you please. Face upstage. Assume Vane's position. Weight on the back foot, left shoulder slightly forward, as the choreography demands. I took the position. Holmes walked to the point from which Strahan had delivered the thrust, the attacker's mark, some 9 feet away on the diagonal. He extended his arm in a straight line toward me, sighting along it as a rifleman sights along a barrel. From this position, Holmes said, Strahan's thrust, delivered on the flat, at full extension, our wrist locked, travels along a vector that arrives at Watson's torso approximately here. He approached me and placed the tip of his finger against my left chest, between the 4th and 5th ribs, precisely where the blade had entered Roderick Vane. Now, Holmes continued, Watson, move to the original mark, 6 inches upstage right. I shifted to the first chalk cross. Holmes returned to Strahan's position and repeated the sighting. From the original position, he announced, the identical thrust, same angle, same extension, same mechanical execution, arrives here. He approached me again and placed his finger against my left shoulder, well above the rib cage and lateral to the thorax. A glancing contact at most, with a prop blade, a bruise, with a real blade, a flesh wound, painful but survivable, and at this angle, unlikely to penetrate deeper than the deltoid muscle. He stepped back and addressed the room. The difference between these two outcomes is 6 inches. One position produces a shoulder wound. The other produces a direct path between the 4th and 5th ribs, the precise intercostal corridor to the heart. The same thrust, the same blade, the same performer executing the same choreography with the same mechanical precision. The only variable is the victim's position, and that variable was changed. Lestrade, who had been watching with the skeptical attentiveness of a man who suspects he is being led somewhere he does not wish to go, spoke up. You're saying someone moved the chalk mark? I am saying someone arranged for Vane to stand in a position that transformed a theatrical flourish into an execution. The original choreography was safe. It was designed to be safe by a man who has spent 12 years ensuring that no blade contacts a body. The alteration defeated that safety with surgical precision. Whoever made this change understood the choreography, understood the geometry of the stage, and understood human anatomy well enough to calculate the exact position from which a straight thrust would find the heart. That narrows the field considerably, Lestrade said. It does. And it narrows it further when you consider what this adjustment required. It was not enough to move a chalk mark on the floor. Vane would have noticed a discrepancy between his rehearsed position and a new mark. The adjustment had to be communicated to Vane through legitimate channels, a plausible instruction from someone with the authority to alter blocking. And the choreographer did not authorize this change. That leaves us with a limited number of people whose instructions Vane would have accepted without question. Holmes turned to Delacroix. Monsieur, who informed you of the blocking change? Delacroix's expression tightened. He consulted his notebook, though I suspected the gesture was less about memory than about composing himself. Miss Voss, he said. She spoke to me approximately 2 hours before curtain. She said that Mr. Vane's position during the final phrase was unflattering from the royal box, that Mrs. Hargrove had expressed a preference for better sidelines. She asked that Vane be moved slightly downstage left. It seemed a reasonable request. Performers often make minor adjustments for the benefit of the important patrons. I saw no reason to refuse. And you communicated the change to Mr. Vane? I marked the new position myself and informed Mr. Vane during the half-hour call. He accepted it without objection. He was accustomed to such adjustments. Holmes was silent for a moment. The work lights hummed above us. The empty theatre stretched away into shadow, its rows of vacant seats like the tiers of an amphitheatre awaiting a verdict. This is not coincidence, Holmes said at last. His voice had taken on the particular quality it assumed when he was no longer reasoning but declaring, when the deductive chain had been assembled and he was reading the result. This is not accident, misfortune, or the tragic convergence of unrelated events. This is engineering. Someone who understood the choreography identified the precise angle of Strand's thrust. Someone who understood anatomy identified the exact position from which that angle would intersect the intercostal space between the fourth and fifth ribs. Someone who understood stage geometry calculated the adjustment, 6 inches no more, required to align the thrust with the target. And someone with sufficient authority communicated that adjustment through a channel that would not be questioned. He looked at each of us in turn, Lestrade, Delacroix, myself. The stage was the weapon, gentlemen. The performance was the method, and 800 witnesses saw nothing because they were told in advance what they were seeing. They came to watch a man die, and so they did, and they applauded. The silence that followed was of a kind I had rarely experienced in Holmes's company. Not the productive silence of thought, but the stunned silence of comprehension. Lestrade stared at the chalk marks on the stage floor, as though they had been written in a language he was only now learning to read. Delacroix had gone very pale. The woman, Lestrade said slowly. Voss. She made the change. She requested the change, Holmes corrected. Whether she understood its purpose, whether she knew what that 6-inch adjustment would accomplish, is a question I have not yet answered, but I intend to. Tonight. He took his hat from the prop table and turned toward the wings. There is a woman backstage who has lied about her whereabouts, altered the conditions that made a murder possible, and is hiding a secret that a dead man was using to destroy her. I think it is time we heard her version of events. All of it, this time, without the performance. Chapter 7. The Woman and the Secret. We returned to the theatre that evening. The winter dark had come early, and the royal sovereign stood against the sky like a mausoleum, its portland stone facade grey and lifeless without the animation of gaslight and arriving carriages. A single lamp burned above the stage door. The constable admitted us and reported that Miss Voss was in her dressing room, as Holmes had requested. She had been there since 4 o'clock. She had spoken to no one. Holmes paused in the corridor outside her door. This in itself was unusual. Holmes was not a man given to hesitation. He approached interviews the way a surgeon approaches an incision, with purpose, precision, and an economy of motion that left no room for second thoughts. Yet here he stood, his hand not quite raised to knock, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "what follows may be difficult to hear. I ask that you remain by the door and say nothing unless I invite you to speak. The woman we are about to question has been living under a species of torment that I suspect is worse than anything the law will impose upon her. I do not intend to add to it unnecessarily, but I must have the truth." I nodded. Holmes knocked. "Come in." The dressing room was dimmer than the previous night. Only 2 of the gas brackets were lit, and the effect was intimate, confessional, the soft light pooling around the mirror and the dressing table, leaving the corners in shadow. Voss sat not before the mirror, but on the chaise against the far wall, her knees drawn up beneath a dark wool shawl. Without costume, without makeup, without the architectural precision of her public presentation, she looked smaller, younger, and immeasurably more tired. She regarded Holmes with eyes that held neither hostility nor fear, but rather the flat, exhausted calm of a woman who has been waiting for something terrible and has grown weary of the waiting. "You know," she said. It was not a question. "I know some of it," Holmes replied. He took the wooden chair and drew it to a conversational distance, close enough for quiet speech, far enough to afford her space. It was, I noticed, the first time I had seen him arrange the physical geometry of an interview with consideration for the subject's comfort, rather than his own tactical advantage. "I should like to hear the rest from you. Where shall I begin?" "With the blocking change. You told the choreographer that Vane's position was unflattering from the royal box, that Mrs. Hargrove preferred better sight lines." "Yes." "That was not true." A pause. The shawl tightened around her shoulders. A self-protective gesture, unconscious and revealing. "No, it was not true." "Who asked you to make the change?" Edmund Hale." "And what reason did he give?" Voss closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression. A relinquishment, as though a wall she had been holding upright through sheer force of will had finally been allowed to fall. "You must understand what Roderick Vane was," she said, "not what he appeared to be. Not the great baritone, the darling of the London stage, the man whose voice could make a woman weep from the back of the gallery. What he truly was, beneath the voice and the charm and the reputation. Tell me." "He discovered my secret 18 months ago. I do not know how. I had been so careful for so many years, but he found the letters. Old letters from a life I thought I had buried so deeply that no one would ever find the grave." She rose from the chaise and moved to the dressing table. From a drawer, she produced a small bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. The kind of bundle that accumulates in the hidden compartments of women's lives, carried from address to address, never discarded because the past they represent can neither be displayed nor destroyed. She held them for a moment, then set them on the table between herself and Holmes. "My name is not Leonora Voss," she said. "It has not been my name for 12 years. My real name is Ellen Marsh, and I was born in Leeds, the daughter of a mill worker and a seamstress. I sang in the church choir. I joined the chorus of a provincial touring company at 17. I was talented, everyone said so. But talent from Leeds does not open the doors that talent from Milan does. The opera world is built on mythology, Mr. Holmes. It demands that its goddesses descend from Olympus, not from a terrace house on Kirkstall Road. She paused. Her voice had not wavered. The singer's control held even now. But the effort of that control was visible in the tendons of her throat, the rigid set of her jaw. I invented Leonora Voss. Every detail. The Italian mother, the childhood in Florence, the conservatory training in Vienna. I invented her biography, her accent, her mannerisms. I studied Italian until I dreamed in it. Our eye cultivated relationships with people who had never been to Florence and would not think to verify my claims. And it worked. Within 3 years, Leonora Voss was performing at Covent Garden. Within 5, she was the leading soprano in London. Ellen Marsh ceased to exist. I buried her, and I truly believed, that the burial was permanent. Until Vane found the letters. Old correspondence between Ellen Marsh and her mother, written during my first years in London. They contained details that were unmistakable. References to Leeds, to my father's death, to the touring company. How Vane obtained them, I still do not know. But he came to me 18 months ago with photocopies and a smile that I shall remember until I die, and he told me what my silence would cost. What did he demand? Voss's hands closed on the edge of the dressing table. Her knuckles whitened. Money, at first. Significant sums, enough to strain even a principal's salary. Then, favours. Professional accommodations. I was to advocate for his casting preferences with the company director. I was to withdraw from roles he wanted for his protégés. I was to become, in effect, his instrument. My career, my reputation, my voice, all deployed in the service of his ambition. She paused, and there were other demands, of a more personal nature, which I will not describe. The silence that followed was dense with implication. Holmes did not press. He sat very still, his gaze steady on Voss's face. And in his expression, I saw something I had rarely witnessed in all our years together. Not pity, which Holmes would have considered an indulgence, but a cold, precise anger directed not at the woman before him, but at the dead man whose cruelty had set this entire mechanism in motion. "You confided in Hale," Holmes said. 3 weeks ago. I could bear it no longer. Edmund he had always been kind to me, quiet, attentive, reliable. In a world of performers and egotists, he was the one person who seemed to see me without wanting something from me. I told him everything. The blackmail, my real identity, the things Vane had made me do. I told him because I had no one else to tell, and because I was drowning, and he was the nearest hand. And what did Hale propose? He said he had a plan. He said that if Vane were injured during the performance, visibly, publicly, or in a way that could be attributed to a prop malfunction, it would serve 2 purposes. It would frighten Vane into abandoning the blackmail, because a man who has narrowly survived a public accident does not invite further scrutiny into his affairs, and it would create a plausible explanation that would protect everyone involved. A tragic malfunction, an investigation, new safety protocols. The matter would be closed. He told you the blade would wound, not kill. He told me the blade would be sharpened, enough to break the skin, to draw blood, to create a wound that would look alarming under the lights, but would not be dangerous. He said the positioning was critical, that vein needed to be in precisely the right spot for the blade to make contact with the fleshy part of the shoulder. A surface wound, and nothing more. And the blocking change. He asked me to request it through Delacroix. He gave me the exact position, 6 inches downstage left of the original mark. He said it was necessary for the geometry. I did not question it. I trusted him. You trusted a man who was proposing to stab another man on stage. Voss flinched as though struck. I trusted a man who told me he was offering me a way out. I had been under Vane's control for 18 months. I had given him money, dignity, autonomy. Things I could not afford to lose and could never recover. Edmund offered me a door. I walked through it. I did not stop to examine the hinges. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Miss Voss, I must ask you directly, when did you understand that Hale intended to kill Vane? The sound she made was not a sob. It was something more private and more terrible. A single exhalation that carried the weight of every night she had spent since the murder, reconstructing the architecture of her own complicity. When he fell, she whispered. When Roderick fell and did not move. When I saw his face. I knew in that instant that Edmund had lied to me, that the blade was not sharpened. It was real, that the position was not for a shoulder wound. It was for the heart. I knew, and I understood, that I had helped him do it, and that everything he had told me was a performance, the most perfect performance in that theatre, and I was his audience. Holmes was silent for a long moment. The gas bracket hissed softly. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. "Ah, you lied about your whereabouts at 5:30, Holmes said. You told me you were in your dressing room. A stagehand saw you leaving the prop storage corridor. I went to see Edmund to confirm that the plan, what I believed was the plan, was in place. He told me everything was ready. He was calm, steady. He looked at me and said, 'After tonight, he will never trouble you again.' I thought he meant the wound would be enough. I thought he meant the fear would silence Vane." She pressed her hands against her face. He meant something else entirely. Holmes rose. He stood for a moment, looking down at the bundle of letters on the dressing table, the fragile documentary record of a life constructed on deception and destroyed by a man who found the seam. "Miss Voss," he said, "I address you so deliberately. I have known your true name since yesterday evening, and I have chosen not to use it. Not from courtesy, but because the woman who built a career and an identity from nothing deserves to be addressed by the name she earned, whatever the law may eventually determine about the name she was given." Voss looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her gaze was steady. "You are guilty of conspiracy," Holmes continued. "You altered the conditions that made this murder possible. The law will hold you accountable for that, and I cannot prevent it. But I will tell Inspector Lestrade, and I will testify, if called upon, that you were deliberately misled about the nature of the act you were facilitating. You conspired to wound. You did not conspire to kill. The distinction matters, in law and in justice. And Edmund." Holmes's expression hardened. A subtle shift, a cooling of the grey eyes that transformed his face from that of an investigator into something older and less merciful. Edmund Hale forged a duplicate key 6 weeks before the murder. He acquired a military-grade blade from an antique weapons dealer. He engineered a mechanism of extraordinary precision, a 3-part device constructed from a weapon, a position, and an unwitting executioner. And he told you the blade would wound, knowing with mathematical certainty that it would kill. He recruited your fear and your trust and fashioned them into instruments of his design. That is not protection, Miss Voss. That is direction. He moved toward the door. I have one more question. The opera, Il Duello Fatale. Whose suggestion was it for the season premiere? Voss frowned. I'm not certain. The programming committee selects the season, but Edmund sits on the technical advisory panel. He would have had input on which productions were feasible given the theatre's capabilities. Her expression changed as the implication reached her. You think he chose the opera? I think a man who spent 6 weeks engineering a murder through the mechanics of a stage duel may have spent rather longer ensuring that the right duel was scheduled. But that is a question for another day. Holmes opened the door. In the corridor, the cold air of the unheated theatre pressed against us. He walked in silence for some time before speaking. She was as much his instrument as Strand was Watson. The tenor held the blade. The woman moved the mark. Neither understood the score they were performing. Only the conductor knew the music, and the conductor was not Kemp. Will you tell Lestrade tonight? Tomorrow. There is one more act to play, and I prefer to stage it on my own terms. He turned up his collar against the chill. The theatre lends itself to revelation, does it not? Tomorrow I shall assemble the company on that stage and demonstrate how a man can be murdered in front of 800 witnesses by a killer who never touches the blade, never approaches the victim, and never steps into the light. The invisible man, the stage manager, the architect of the perfect crime. He paused at the stage door and looked back into the darkened theatre. The vast, hollow space where a man had died to applause and a woman had watched her complicity become murder. Almost perfect, he corrected himself quietly. The flaw, as always, was in assuming that no one looks at what they are not supposed to see. Chapter 8. The Man in the Shadows. Holmes did not return to Baker Street that night. He sent me home in a cab with instructions to sleep, instructions I followed imperfectly, and remained at the theatre. When I arrived the following morning at 8:30, I found him in Edmund Hale's backstage workshop, seated on an upturned crate, his coat draped over a sawhorse, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the remains of a small fire smouldering in a tin pail that served, I gathered, as the stage crew's unofficial source of warmth during the winter months. He had not slept. I could see it in the particular sharpness of his features, the way exhaustion pared Holmes down to his essential architecture, all bone and tendon, and the restless, luminous energy of a mind that refused to observe the body's limitations. He was holding a pair of dark leather gloves, Hale's working gloves, which Lestrade had collected during the first night's interviews and which Holmes had evidently retrieved from the evidence box. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "tell me what you see." He held the gloves out. I took them and examined them under the workshop's single gas bracket. They were well worn, soft, supple leather, moulded by years of use to the shape of their owner's hands. The right glove was unremarkable. The left told a different story. On the inner surface of the thumb and forefinger, the grip surface, where thumb and finger would close around a narrow object, there was a faint discoloration, dark, reddish-brown. I tilted the glove toward the light, and the stain resolved itself into a pattern. A linear smear, approximately 3 inches long, running along the axis of the grip. Not a splash, not a radial spread, a line. Blood, I said, on the grip surface of the left glove. Hale's explanation, offered to Lestrade on the night of the murder, is that he touched the body when he rushed to the stage after the death was discovered. He was the first to reach vein. This is confirmed by multiple witnesses. He knelt beside the body. He checked for signs of life, a natural response, and one that would account for the presence of blood on his hands. But the pattern is wrong, I said, understanding now what Holmes had seen. Demonstrate, Watson. Press your thumb against my wrist, firmly, as one would press against a wound to check for a pulse or to stanch bleeding. I did so, pressing the pad of my thumb against the inside of Holmes's wrist. He withdrew his hand and examined the impression left on my thumb by the ink he had smeared on his skin, without my noticing. Radial, he said. A contact transfer from a curved surface, a body, a wound, a limb, produces a pattern that spreads outward from the point of contact. The pressure is greatest at the center and diminishes toward the edges. The shape is roughly circular or elliptical. That is the signature of touching a wound. He took the glove from me and held it up. This pattern is linear, a straight smear along the axis of the grip. The line produced when a hand closes around a narrow cylindrical object and slides along its length. A blade handle, a sword grip. The blood was not acquired by touching a wound. It was acquired by handling a bloodied weapon. He gripped the blade after the killing. He was the first to reach the body. In the confusion, the cast flooding the stage, the audience still applauding, the curtain descending, he had perhaps 30 seconds of unobserved access, time enough to extract the blade from the wound, or at the very least, to grip the handle and confirm its position. The blood transferred to his glove in that moment. He then called for the curtain and assumed the role of the concerned stage manager, tending to a fallen performer. By the time Dr. Lewin arrived, Hale was standing 3 feet from the body with his arms crossed and his gloves folded against his sleeves, the blood hidden in the natural creases of the leather. Holmes set the glove down and rose from his crate. He moved through the workshop with the slow, deliberate attention of a man reading a room the way a scholar reads a manuscript. Every object a word, every arrangement a sentence. The workshop was Hale's kingdom. It occupied a low-ceiling space beneath the fly gallery, accessible through a narrow door that bore no nameplate and no lock. The walls were lined with tools, hammers, saws, chisels, pliers, each hanging from its designated hook, each outline traced in pencil on the wall behind it so that any absence would be immediately visible. Coils of rope hung from ceiling pegs in ascending order of thickness. Tins of paint were arranged by color on a shelf, their labels facing outward, their lids sealed. A workbench ran the length of the far wall, its surface scarred by decades of use, but scrupulously clean, every tool in its place, every material sorted and stored. 15 years, Holmes said, surveying the space. Hale has worked in this theatre for 15 years. He built this domain. Every hook, every shelf, every system of organization is his creation. He knows the position of every rope, every pulley, every trapdoor, every sight line. He knows which floorboards creak and which are silent. He knows the timing of every cue, the duration of every scene change, the precise number of seconds between a lighting shift and a curtain call. This theatre is an extension of his nervous system. He inhabits it the way a spider inhabits its web, aware of every vibration, in control of every strand. He paused at the workbench, and yet no one sees him. That is the essential fact, Watson. In 15 years of controlling the physical reality of every production on that stage, Edmund Hale has never once been acknowledged by name in a program, a review, or a curtain call. The performers take the balls. The conductor takes the balls. The director, the designer, the choreographer, all take their share of public recognition. The stage manager is invisible. His competence is assumed. His presence is expected. His absence would be catastrophic, but his attendance is unremarked. He is the gravity that holds the system together, fundamental, invisible, and taken entirely for granted. Holmes turned to me. What does that do to a man? A Watson? 15 years of essential, unrecognized labor. 15 years of watching lesser talents receive the applause that his work makes possible. 15 years of building other people's illusions while remaining himself, perpetually in shadow. It breeds resentment, I said. In some men, yes. In others, it breeds something more dangerous. A desire not for recognition, but for proof. Proof of one's own capability. Proof that the invisible man is, in fact, the most powerful person in the room. Hale did not kill Roderick Vane for Leonora Voss's sake, though he told himself he did, and though his affection for her is genuine. He killed Vane because the murder itself was the proof. The stage was his instrument. The performers were his cast. The audience was his house. And the death, engineered through the machinery of the theatre itself, invisible to every eye, executed with a precision that no performer could match, was his masterwork, the one production that was truly and entirely his. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the unheated workshop. Holmes's analysis had the quality of a post-mortem, clinical, precise, and deeply unsettling in its implications. He was describing not merely a murder, but a psychology, the interior architecture of a man who had found, in the mechanics of killing, the creative fulfillment that 15 years of legitimate work had denied him. There is one more thing, Holmes said. He returned to the workbench and indicated the bottom drawer, the one in which he had found the duplicate key the previous night. The false bottom was not the only modification Hale made to this workbench. He reached beneath the bench itself, not into a drawer, but underneath the structure, running his fingers along the underside of the top surface. There was a soft click. A narrow panel, invisible from any angle except directly below, swung downward on a concealed hinge. From the hidden compartment, Holmes withdrew a small leather case, no larger than a cigar box. Inside, arranged with the same meticulous precision that characterized everything in Hale's domain, were 3 items: a receipt from a locksmith in Bermondsey, dated 6 weeks before the murder, for 1 brass key, cut to specification, cash paid; a receipt from an antique weapons dealer near Covent Garden, dated 3 weeks before the murder, for 1 military rapier, pattern 1853, at serviceable condition, and a folded sheet of paper covered in Hale's small, precise handwriting. Holmes unfolded the paper. It was a diagram, a scale drawing of the stage, with measurements, angles, and annotations. The positions of the performers during the Act 3 duel were marked with small crosses. 2 positions for Vane were indicated, the original and the adjusted, and from each, a line was drawn to indicate the trajectory of Strand's thrust. The line from the original position terminated at the shoulder. The line from the adjusted position terminated at the heart. Beside the second line, in Hale's neat hand, were 2 words, clean path. Holmes held the diagram for me to see. This is not speculation, Watson. This is the blueprint, drawn by the architect in his own hand, how with the precision of an engineer designing a machine. He calculated the geometry. He tested the angles. He determined, with mathematical certainty, that the adjustment he proposed to Voss would direct strands thrust into the one corridor between the ribs that would reach the heart. This was not a plan to wound. This was never a plan to wound. From the very beginning, from the moment he had the key cut in Bermondsey, Edmund Hale intended to kill Roderick Vane. He replaced the items in their case and closed the hidden compartment. Lestrade will want all of this, and he shall have it this afternoon on the stage in front of everyone. Hale has spent 15 years building illusions for other people. Today I shall dismantle his. We left the workshop. In the corridor, our Holmes stopped and looked back at the unmarked door, the entrance to the Invisible Man's domain. He told Voss the blade would wound, Holmes said quietly. He looked into the eyes of a woman who trusted him, a woman who had come to him in desperation, who had offered him the most vulnerable truth of her life. And he lied. He recruited her fear and her trust and fashioned them into components of his machine. She moved the mark believing she was saving herself. She was, in fact, performing the role he had written for her. As surely as Strand performed the thrust and Vane performed the death. You said his affection for her was genuine. It is, and that makes it worse, not better. He loved her enough to kill for her, but not enough to tell her the truth. He needed her cooperation, and the truth would have cost him that, so he lied. He wrapped the murder in a fiction she could accept, a wound, a warning, a way out, and let her walk onto that stage believing she was party to a lesser crime. That is not devotion, Watson. That is the most intimate species of betrayal, the betrayal that wears the face of protection. He set off toward the stage. Send word to Lestrade. Tell him to assemble the company at 3 o'clock. Every suspect, every witness, every person who was backstage on the night of the performance. The work lights, Watson, not the limelights. I want them to see it all, without illusion, without shadow, without the mercy of theatrical lighting. He paused at the edge of the wings and looked out at the empty stage, the bare boards, the chalk marks, the harsh white glare that stripped away every pretense. It is time, he said, to raise the curtain on the final act. Chapter 9, The Conspiracy Revealed. The stage of the Royal Sovereign Theatre, stripped of its painted flats and hanging borders, was a bleak and unforgiving space. The work lights, harsh electrical lamps that the theatre had recently installed for maintenance purposes, cast a flat, shadowless glare across the boards, eliminating every pocket of darkness, every gradient of atmosphere, every trick of depth and dimension that made theatrical illusion possible. Under these lights, the stage was not a world. It was a room. A large, bare, slightly shabby room with scuffed floorboards and a faintly sour smell of old paint and human perspiration. Holmes had arranged the assembly with the precision of a director blocking a scene. Chairs had been placed in a loose semicircle at centre stage, facing a single point, the position from which Holmes would speak. The suspects occupied the front rank. Alaric Strand, pale and hollow-eyed, his left hand trembling in his lap. Leonora Voss, composed but brittle, her gaze fixed on some middle distance. Julius Kemp, fidgeting with his cuffs, his restless energy constrained to the smallest possible movements. Mrs. Adela Hargrove, magnificent in black bombazine, her posture communicating the settled indignation of a woman unaccustomed to being summoned. And Edmund Hale, seated slightly apart from the others, his hands resting on his knees, his expression one of attentive, cooperative calm. Behind them, in a second row, sat the supporting witnesses, the choreographer Delacroix, his notebook open, the cellist Parrish, uncomfortable in a suit that did not fit him, the dresser, Mrs. Belling, eye clutching a handkerchief, the house manager, 2 stagehands. Lestrade stood at the wing, flanked by 2 constables, his arms folded and his face arranged in the expression of tolerant skepticism that he reserved for Holmes's theatrical revelations, an expression that, in my experience, invariably gave way to reluctant admiration before the performance was through. I took my position near the wings, close enough to observe every face, far enough to remain unobtrusive. Holmes stood at his designated point, the killing blade laid across a small table beside him, and waited until the murmuring subsided into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "2 nights ago, on this stage, Roderick Vane was killed. He was killed in full view of 800 people during a performance attended by the cream of London society, and not one person in that audience understood what they had witnessed. They applauded his death. They praised the realism of his final moments. They went home believing they had seen a tragedy performed. They had, but it was not the tragedy the program advertised." He paused. His gaze moved across the assembled faces, not with accusation, but with the measured attention of a man who has solved an equation and is preparing to show his work. "I shall begin with the obvious solution. It is the solution that Inspector Lestrade arrived at within minutes of examining the scene, and it is the solution that any competent investigator would reach on the basis of the available evidence. It is also wrong." He turned to Strand. "Mr. Strand, you held the blade. You delivered the thrust that killed Roderick Vane, and you had ample motive. Professional jealousy, public humiliation, the slow destruction of your career by a man who dismissed you as furniture. Half the company heard you express a wish for Vane's death. You are, by every conventional measure, the murderer." Strand sat rigid, his jaw clenched. He said nothing. "But you are not." Holmes picked up the killing blade. "This weapon weighs 615 grams. The prop it replaced weighs 410, a difference of over 200 grams, perceptible to any man who has handled a blade. You did not perceive it, because you collected this weapon from the prop table in the rush before Act 3, held it for a matter of seconds, and set it down. You never had the opportunity to register the discrepancy, because the conditions of your collection were designed to prevent it." He set the blade down. "Furthermore, your choreography was mechanically identical to every rehearsal. Monsieur Delacroix has confirmed this. The foot placement, the arm extension, the wrist angle, the follow-through, all precisely as rehearsed. A man who knows he is driving a real blade into living flesh will betray it in his body. There is always a variation, a tightened grip, a pull thrust, a micro-hesitation. There was none. You performed a rehearsed motion. The killing was in the conditions, not in the man." He turned to address the room. "And there is the matter of sound. Mr. Parrish, the cellist seated nearest the stage, noted that the acoustic signature of the blades was different on the night of the premiere. Fuller, more resonant, steel on steel, are not aluminium on aluminium. This difference was present from the first clash of the duel, confirming that the real blade was in position before the performance began. The swap occurred before Mr. Strachan ever touched the weapon. Holmes let this settle. Strachan's face had undergone a transformation, the rigid tension dissolving into something raw and unguarded, the expression of a man being told that the nightmare he has been living inside has a door. So much for the obvious solution, Holmes said. Let us turn to the financial one. He addressed Kemp. Mr. Kemp, you and Vane were joint investors in a planned concert hall. Vane had threatened to withdraw and to commission an audit that would have revealed your embezzlement of project funds. Your career and your freedom were at stake. The motive is compelling. Kemp opened his mouth. Holmes raised a hand. But the mechanics exclude you. The orchestra pit connects to backstage through a single maintenance hatch, bolted from the backstage side. I examined it. The bolt is stiff with old paint. The dust around it is undisturbed. The hatch has not been opened in months. You were physically contained in the pit for the duration of the performance. Your embezzlement is real. Your desperation is genuine, and the law will take its course regarding both. But you did not kill Roderick Vane. Kemp subsided into his chair with the deflated relief of a man who has been told he is guilty of the lesser charge. Holmes turned now to Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove, you were backstage before the performance. You were seen near the prop storage corridor. You had motive. Vane was courting a rival patron, threatening your position as the company's principal benefactress, and you are concealing a further connection to the victim. A brief romantic liaison ended 2 years ago, which Vane never forgave. Hargrove's composure, which had held admirably throughout, fractured along a single precise line. A flush rose from her collar to her cheekbones. She did not speak. But you were accompanied by the house manager for the entirety of your backstage visit. You did not enter the prop storage area. Your purpose was to deliver flowers to Miss Voss, a routine patron's gesture, confirmed by 3 witnesses. Your secrets, Mrs. Hargrove, are your own. They do not include murder. Holmes paused. He had cleared the stage, systematically and methodically, of every suspect but 2. The room understood this. The silence had acquired the dense, anticipatory quality of an audience that senses the approaching climax. Which brings us, Holmes said quietly, to the woman and the man. He turned to Voss. His voice, when he spoke, was gentler, not softer, but stripped of the prosecutorial edge that had characterized his dismantling of the other suspects. Miss Voss, your real name is Ellen Marsh. You were born in Leeds. You invented your identity, your biography, and your career. Roderick Vane discovered this and used it to control you. Through blackmail, financial extortion, and coercions of a personal nature that I shall not detail here. A murmur passed through the assembly. Voss sat motionless, her eyes fixed on Holmes. She did not weep. She did not protest. She endured, with the discipline of a woman who had spent 12 years maintaining a performance and understood that this, too, must be faced without flinching. You altered the stage blocking on the night of the premiere. You told the choreographer that Vane's position was unflattering from the royal box. You moved him 6 inches downstage left. A minor adjustment, invisible to the audience, catastrophic in its consequences. That 6-inch shift transformed a safe choreographic angle into a direct path between the 4th and 5th ribs. You enabled the geometry that made the murder possible. Holmes paused. but you did not intend his death. Voss's composure held, but only just. A tremor passed through her, visible in her hands, her shoulders, the muscles of her throat. You were told, by a man you trusted, that the blade would cause a wound, a surface injury, a warning, a way to end the blackmail through a plausible theatrical accident. You agreed because you were desperate, because you had been systematically destroyed by the man who held your secret, and because the alternative was the annihilation of everything you had built. You conspired to wound. You did not conspire to kill. And when Vane fell, when you saw his face, you understood that you had been lied to, that the plan you believed you were executing was not the plan that was executed. Holmes turned. The room turned with him. Every eye followed his gaze to the man seated slightly apart from the others. The quiet, precise, deferential man who had answered every question thoroughly, cooperated with every request, and spent the entirety of the investigation hiding in the one place no one thought to look. Plain sight. "Mr. Hale," Holmes said. Edmund Hale met his gaze. His expression did not change. The cooperative calm, the helpful, unassuming, invisible man composure that had defined his presence throughout, remained perfectly intact. He sat with his hands on his knees, his posture upright, his face arranged in an expression of attentive interest. He looked, in that moment, exactly like what he had always appeared to be, the most reliable man in the building. 6 weeks before the murder, Holmes said, you had a duplicate key made for the prop storage case. A locksmith in Bermondsey, cash payment, false name. The key is fractionally imprecise. It leaves parallel scratches on the lock plate that your master key does not. I found the duplicate in the false bottom of your workbench. Hale did not react. His eyes remained on Holmes. 3 weeks before the murder, you purchased a military rapier from an antique dealer near Covent Garden. Pattern 1853. Serviceable condition. Selected specifically for dimensional similarity to the stage props. Close enough to pass casual inspection, different enough to kill. Still nothing. The silence from Hale was not the silence of shock or calculation. It was the silence of a man who is watching a performance and waiting to see how it ends. The evening before the premiere, you entered the theatre alone, as you routinely do for closing checks. You opened the prop case with the duplicate key. You swapped the prop rapier for the real blade. The scratch on the lock plate was made at that moment. You placed the killing weapon in the position from which Strand would collect it the following evening, knowing that the conditions of his collection, the pre-show rush, his compromised nerves, the brevity of his contact with the weapon, would prevent him from detecting the substitution. You told Miss Voss that the blade would wound. You told her the positioning was critical for a shoulder injury. You gave her the exact adjustment, 6 inches downstage left, and asked her to request it through the choreographer. She did so, believing she was enabling a non-fatal warning. You knew, with mathematical certainty, demonstrated by the diagram I found concealed in your workbench, that the adjusted position would direct Strand's thrust not into the shoulder, but into the heart. Holmes picked up the killing blade. He held it by the guard, the steel catching the harsh work light. Your left glove bears a blood smear consistent with gripping this handle, not with touching a wound. You handled this blade after the killing, in the seconds before anyone else reached the body. The blood pattern is linear along the grip axis. Contact transfer from a wound produces radial spread. You did not touch Roderick Vane. You touched the weapon that killed him. Holmes set the blade down for the final time. No single person committed this murder. It required 3 elements. Access to the weapon. That was you. Alteration of the stage geometry. That was Miss Voss, acting on your instructions and your deception. An unwitting hand to deliver the blow. That was Strand, performing with the mechanical precision you relied upon. I remove any element and the murder does not occur. But only one mind designed the mechanism. Only one mind understood the complete architecture. Only one mind intended death from the beginning. The silence held. Every person on that stage was motionless. And then Hale spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, entirely composed. He did not rise from his chair. He did not protest or deny. He looked at Holmes with an expression that contained, beneath its surface, calm, something that might have been recognition, the gaze of a craftsman acknowledging the work of another. 15 years, Hale said. 15 years I built their illusions. Every entrance, every exit, every trick of light and timing. Not once did anyone see me. Not the performers, not the directors, not the critics, not the audience. He paused. You are the first. You built a stage within a stage, Holmes replied. A performance inside a performance. You directed a murder and cast your conspirator and your weapon without their knowledge. It is, I confess, the most elegant mechanism I have encountered. His voice hardened. And the most repellent. Hale inclined his head. A small, precise gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been a bow. It was not the blade that killed him, Mr. Holmes. You understand that. It was the precision, the architecture, the convergence of elements that no one else could see, because no one else knew the complete design. You are right, Holmes said. It was not the blade that killed Roderick Vane. It was the precision of 2 minds working as one, though only one of those minds knew the true score. Hale regarded him for a long, still moment. Then he nodded, as if a question he had long carried had finally been answered. Lestrade stepped forward from the wings. Chapter 10. The final curtain. Hale rose before Lestrade reached him. He stood with the unhurried composure of a man who has been expecting this moment, not with dread, but with the quiet satisfaction of an architect watching the final stone set into place. He adjusted his cuffs. He straightened the collar of his dark jacket. These small, precise gestures, the habits of a man whose life had been defined by the meticulous arrangement of details, were, I realized, his own private curtain call. The last performance of the stage manager he conducted for an audience of 1, himself. Lestrade produced the handcuffs with the practiced economy of long routine. Edmund Hale, I am arresting you for the murder of Roderick Vane. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say. I understand, Inspector. Hale's voice was level. He extended his wrist with a cooperation so total that it bordered on courtesy. The handcuffs closed with a sound that seemed, in the silent theatre, disproportionately loud. A mechanical finality that echoed briefly against the bare brick of the fly gallery, and then was absorbed into the vast emptiness of the house. Hale turned. His gaze found Leonora Voss, who sat where she had been throughout Holmes's revelation. Motionless, upright, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that I recognized now, not as composure, but as its opposite. The absolute physical rigidity of a woman holding herself together against a force that threatened to unmake her entirely. Hale looked at her for a long moment. His expression, which had maintained its architectural calm throughout Holmes's systematic dismantling of his work, changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but with a small, private softening around the eyes that was more devastating than any display of emotion I had witnessed in the course of this investigation. It was the look of a man who understands that the thing he built, not the murder, but the years of quiet devotion that preceded it, is about to be redefined by its final act, and that the woman for whom he built it will remember not the devotion, but the betrayal. "I kept my promise," he said. "He will never trouble you again." Voss stared after him as Lestrade led him toward the wings. She did not speak. She did not weep. She watched him go with an expression that contained, in its depths, a grief so complex and so contradictory that I could not have named its components if I had been given a lifetime to study them. Gratitude and horror, relief and revulsion. The shattering recognition that the man who had protected her had also used her, that his devotion and his manipulation were not separate impulses, but two faces of the same coin, inseparable, irreconcilable, and now permanently beyond the reach of explanation or repair. At the edge of the wings, Hale paused. He looked back, not at Voss, but at the stage itself. The bare boards, the chalk marks, the work light stripping away every shadow. He regarded it the way a man regards a home he is leaving for the last time. Not with sentimentality, but with the private, unshareable knowledge of what the place had meant and what it would never mean again. Then he turned and walked into the wings, and the shadows received him as they always had, silently, completely, without remark. Lestrade returned after a few minutes. The constables had taken Hale to the waiting van. The inspector approached Holmes with the expression of a man who wishes to offer congratulations, but suspects they may not be welcome. "Clean work, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I'll need your written statement for the prosecution, and the physical evidence, the key, the receipts, and the diagram." "You shall have everything, Inspector." "I suggest you also take a formal statement from Miss Voss at the earliest opportunity. She will need legal counsel. I would recommend she engage it before speaking to your officers." Lestrade glanced toward Voss, who remained seated, motionless, on the now emptying stage. The other witnesses had begun to disperse. Kemp hurrying away with the furtive haste of a man who knows his own reckoning is approaching. Hargrove departing with the rigid dignity of offended propriety. Strand lingering in the wings, uncertain, his gaze returning again and again to the spot where Vane had fallen. Delacroix closed his notebook and slipped away without a word. Parrish had already gone. "She'll be charged as an accessory," Lestrade said. "No way around it." "No," Holmes agreed. "There is not. She altered the conditions that enabled the murder. The law will hold her to account. But I would ask you to note, in your report and in your testimony, that she was deliberately misled about the nature of the act she was facilitating. She believed she was enabling a wound. The evidence supports this. Her horror at Vane's death was observed by multiple witnesses, and her behavior in the hours following is inconsistent with a woman who expected a fatal outcome. She is guilty of conspiracy. She is not guilty of murder. The distinction may not save her, but it should be recorded." Lestrade nodded, not with enthusiasm, but with the grudging acknowledgement of a man who recognizes justice when it is pointed out to him, even when it complicates his paperwork. He collected the evidence, issued instructions to his remaining constable, and departed. The stage was empty now. Holmes and I stood alone under the work lights. Two men in an abandoned theatre, surrounded by the residue of a crime that had been conceived, executed, and solved within these walls. The silence was immense. Not the expectant silence of a house waiting for the curtain to rise, but the exhausted silence that follows the final curtain. The silence of a space that has been emptied of its purpose and does not yet know what will fill it. Holmes was looking at the chalk marks on the stage floor. The two positions, original and adjusted, were still visible, their geometry still legible to the eye that knew what to read in them. 6 inches. The distance between a flesh wound and a death. The distance between a woman's desperate hope and a man's cold calculation. The distance, I thought, and between the story Hale told Voss and the story he told himself. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last. "There is nothing more for us here." We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon. The grey winter light was already failing, and Mrs. Hudson had lit the fire in anticipation of our return. The sitting room, with its familiar clutter of papers, chemical apparatus, unanswered correspondence, and the Turkish slipper in which Holmes kept his tobacco, felt, after the cold grandeur of the theatre, like a return to solid ground after a long passage through uncertain terrain. Holmes settled into his chair and filled his pipe. He did not speak for some time. The fire crackled. The light dimmed. I poured 2 glasses of brandy and set one at his elbow, where it remained untouched. "Was justice done?" I asked at last, and Holmes drew on his pipe. The smoke curled upward and dissipated in the warm air. His expression, in the firelight, was not triumphant. It was not satisfied. It was reflective. The expression of a man who has completed a task and is now calculating its cost. "Justice," he repeated, as though testing the word for structural integrity. Vane was a predator. He discovered a woman's most vulnerable secret and used it to destroy her autonomy, her finances, and her dignity. He was methodical in his cruelty and indifferent to its consequences. The world is not diminished by his absence. But Hale did not merely protect her. He used her. He took her fear and her trust, the most intimate things she had offered him, and he fashioned them into instruments of his design. He told her the blade would wound. He looked into the eyes of a woman who had come to him in desperation, who had offered him the rawest truth of her life, and he lied, not clumsily, not in the heat of passion, but with the cold precision of a man who has calculated every variable and determined that her ignorance is a necessary component of his mechanism. That is not devotion, Watson. That is direction. He directed her as he directed every element of his stage, positioning her, cueing her, assigning her a role in a performance she did not know she was giving. He paused. The fire settled, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. And Strand, a man whose professional discipline, the very quality that should have been his pride, was identified, targeted, and exploited. Hale chose him not despite his precision, but because of it. Yahide needed a hand that would deliver the thrust exactly as rehearsed, without deviation, without the micro-variations that conscious intent produces. Strand's reliability was his vulnerability. His excellence was the weapon turned against him. "And the audience," I said, "and the audience. 800 people who came to watch a man die, theatrically, safely, within the agreed conventions of performance. and who saw exactly what they expected to see, because expectation is the most powerful form of blindness. They applauded a murder because they had been told by the architecture of the evening that what they were witnessing was art. The stage manager understood this. He understood that the theatre is a machine for directing attention, and that a machine for directing attention is, by definition, a machine for concealing what attention is directed away from. Holmes reached for his brandy at last and held it without drinking. It is, I confess, the only case in which I have been moved not by the complexity of the crime, but by its cruelty. Not the cruelty to the victim. Vane was destroyed by a mechanism more precise than any he employed in his own predations, and there is a symmetry to that which I cannot entirely condemn. The cruelty was to the instruments, the tenor who carried the blade, the woman who moved the mark, the audience who applauded. All of them were cast in a drama they did not know they were performing, by a man whose genius was to remain unseen. He fell silent. I did not press him further. There are moments in the long history of our partnership when Holmes's silence communicates more than his words. Moments when the detective recedes and the man emerges briefly from behind the apparatus of deduction and stands exposed to the full weight of what he has seen. I sat for some time after Holmes retired, not to sleep, I suspected, but to his violin, whose thin, wandering melodies I could hear through the ceiling as I wrote up my notes. The fire burned low. The room darkened. The sounds of Baker Street, the rattle of hansoms, the distant cry of a news vendor, the steady breath of a city that does not pause for the dramas enacted within it, filled the spaces between the notes. I thought of the empty theatre, the bare stage, the chalk marks that told the story of a man's death in the language of geometry and position. I thought of Voss, Ellen Marsh, who had built a life from nothing and watched it disassembled by two men, one who exploited her secret and one who exploited her trust. I thought of Strand, who would carry the memory of resistance against a blade in his wrist for the rest of his life. I thought of Hale, riding now through the dark streets toward a cell, with the composure of a man who had finally been seen. And I thought of the review in the morning paper, the critic who had praised the realism of the death scene, who had admired the conviction of the performance, who had gone home and written his notice without ever suspecting that the fiction he celebrated was, in fact, the truth. The stage was dark now. The players had dispersed, and somewhere in the silence of that empty theatre, I fancied I could still hear the sound of 800 hands clapping